Hello everyone, this is Ed Runkle, pastor at Tapestry Church, seen here weekly on LCTV channel 66, and you may see us live every Sunday morning at 10:30 at 22 Crady Avenue. Good morning everybody, welcome to Tapestry Church. I'm so glad you're here. Let me try to set things up this morning with a little story. It's a made-up story, I'm sure. A guy named Fred got home from golf later than usual one Saturday afternoon, and he was very tired, and so his wife asked him, was it a bad day at the golf course? And he said, yeah, initially everything was going fine, but then Harry had a heart attack and died on the 10th tee. Oh, that's awful, his wife said, to which Fred replied, you're not kidding. For the whole back nine, it was hit the ball, drag Harry, hit the ball, drag Harry. It's not only a made-up story, it's a bad story. I didn't think it was all that funny either. Bridget was like, it's funny, tell the story, they'll laugh. No, actually, Bridget had no idea I was going to tell that story. But here's why I told it. There are people who go through their whole lives something like this. Wake up, drag my wounds. Go to work, drag my wounds. Pick a spouse, drag my wounds. And on and on. Maybe you've come to church this morning dragging some old wounds. I mean, when the scriptures say about Jesus that he came to bind up the brokenhearted, as the Old Testament prophet Isaiah put it, I believe that phrase brokenhearted, at least in part, is a reference to the emotional life of people like you and me, and that healing our damaged emotions means that God is committed to us becoming emotionally healthy and whole, and that, Christianity is above all else a faith about right relationships, vertically with God, but also horizontally with our fellow human beings. And way at the top of the list when it comes to relational and emotional saboteurs is, or enemies of a healthy emotional life or relational life, is this feeling of resentment or ill will as a result of some real or imagined offense. Resentment we hold toward another person. Some might call that unforgiveness. Others would maybe use the term bitterness. But it all refers to the inability or unwillingness to forgive someone who has wronged us. We talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but want to get into some more depth today. And this is from the New Testament book of Ephesians in chapter 4, and I just have a couple of verses for you here. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Honestly, that text there, verses 31 and 32, that makes me feel a little twitchy in that, I wish Paul had said, if someone has sinned against you or someone has offended you or wronged you in some way, then go talk smack about them with a few other people before posting a thinly veiled remark about it on Facebook. But he didn't. And so I had to think all week about how I respond when I've been hurt. And see if this doesn't sound familiar, if any of this doesn't tend to happen when somebody wrongs you. First, instead of doing something externally to harm them, you do something internally to harm them. You harbor bitterness. I mean, this is the psychology of resentment. You exercise emotional punishment toward them internally when actual punishment can't be exercised externally. In fact, if you're anything like me, you spend, about 87% of your mental life or your mental energy winning imaginary arguments that are never actually going to take place. You make up little stories to explain misunderstandings and conflicts, starring yourself as the innocent victim and casting your antagonist as the villain, driven by, sheer unilateral malice. I mean, does anybody else do this? I'm not the only one, am I? I mean, maybe if you're like me, you get bent out of shape and worked up just thinking about your offender's crimes. And your offenders, wherever they may be, know nothing of the ill will you wish for them. They remain unharmed by your faulty telekinetic powers of resentment. While you, on the other hand, are actually suffering for your lack of forgiveness. And so maybe, you self-medicate, or maybe you, do that with drugs or alcohol. Maybe you do that with shopping. Maybe you do that with overeating, or maybe with undereating. Or maybe you feed your desire to make people who have harmed you to pay for what they've done by consuming movies or TV programs or even video games that indulge your revenge fantasies, kind of like a narcotic. It's an empty high, and then you crash only to discover that the reign of Christ is significantly quieter than a Jean-Claude Van Damme or Liam Neeson movie. When you've been wronged, it's so easy to assume that there's nothing that can be done about it. It's so easy to become hardened and cold or bitter, so easy to just clam up. You expect the other person to, come to you and apologize, or at least acknowledge, that something's not right here. And when they don't, it's normal to feel anger and sadness. But to stay angry, that's poisonous. And that won't change the fact that the other person has hurt you. And it certainly won't punish them. It will punish you, however, and everyone in your life that you care about. And so how are we supposed to respond? This is perhaps one of the most difficult positions to be in life. Well, Pastor Paul gives clear instructions here regarding feelings of resentment and bitterness to the early church in Ephesus. He says basically offenses are inevitable, but if we're trying to follow Jesus, we have a choice about how we respond. And we can put away bitterness and instead act in kindness and forgiveness. One of the things about being wrong is that even if we don't go looking for opportunities to return the wrong, we generally stop looking for opportunities to bless the one who's wronged us. In other words, resentment is effective in cutting off our generosity, and we are quick to begrudge and withhold grace. We are natural-born begrudgers and holders of grudges. Maybe you've known someone who's kind of perfected the lengthy grudge, right? No forgiveness until you recognize your fault and grovel at their proverbial feet. Then they might acquiesce and lift you up and give you another chance, so long as you show enough remorse and intention not to repeat the transgression. Cold shoulder, silent treatment, pointed glares, maybe no eye contact whatsoever, and just indirect address until, maybe they get tired of the effort and remember not to forget the episode for future reference as a kind of, type of collateral, if you will, because those who have perfected the, lengthy grudge know you have a storehouse of your past faults to keep you eating out of their hands. Well, here's what I'm trying to get at. If you find yourself holding a grudge, or that you tend to do that, or that you struggle with resentment, you may benefit first from examining your own heart. Because even if you've been wrong, what does your emotional response say about your heart? Is it possible that malice or wrath or bitterness have snuck in? Those things are like alarm systems for your heart, pointing to some issue with you which can often be much bigger than the issue, whatever it is, with your spouse or your friend or your boss, whatever they've done to you. I think of that Seinfeld episode where Babu Bhatt tells Jerry Seinfeld that he's a very, very bad man. Seinfeld is stunned. Was my mother wrong? Seinfeld wonders. Because many of us, we've been told our whole lives that, we can do and be anything we want, in effect, we're wonderful, and that we just have to overcome the external obstacles in our lives. And often those external obstacles are other people. And if we could just fix those people or neutralize those people in some way, then we'd be okay. Now, our resistance to putting down resentment and bitterness sometimes has as much to do with us as it does with the other person. Sometimes part of speaking to others with grace, as Paul referred to it, is discerning what needs confronting and what should be overlooked. I mean, that's a lot of what Paul means by that little phrase, as fits the occasion. In other words, on certain occasions, not all, but certain, confronting little infractions only serves to make things worse. There are times when we need to speak up and confront, and there are times to just let it go. And there's a real art to knowing the difference. I mean, think about it like this. This church will disappoint you, or I will fail to meet your expectations, or I'll say something stupid and hurt your feelings. I mean, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You know, someone, I or someone at this church will disappoint you. And many of you maybe have been around long enough to know that that's already happened. The question, I suppose, is, in a situation of disappointment, are you going to stick around after? Because if you leave, because you've been disappointed, you'll miss the way God's grace kind of fills in the cracks left behind from our brokenness. And that's not something to miss. I mean, a guy named Henry Nouwen once put what I'm trying to get at like this: forgiveness is the name of love practiced among people who love poorly. The hard truth is that all people love poorly. We need to forgive and be forgiven every day, every hour, increasingly. This is the great work of love among the fellowship of the weak that is the human family. And see, this kind of love, we can only kind of live this kind of love if we put our trust in God's ability to not be stymied by our messes. If we put our trust in Jesus, who defiantly keeps showing up despite us, and who says, we're two or more people who get things wrong, or we're two or more people who are kind of cranky sometimes, or we're two or more people who triangulate and gossip about each other are gathered, I am there. He is there. That's His promise. He is there with the power that is not our own. He is there with the power of one who has given all for us. He's there with the power of reconciliation for people who don't deserve it. I mean, think about it like this. I read an article recently about 3 ways that we view people, 3 levels. And level 1 is kind of the way that a child sees other people. Before a child hits a certain level of age and experience, they generally don't see faults in others. All is good. Well, level 2 then is when we grow up a little bit and wise up, kind of like a teenager. Now we can see the faults in others clearly, and so we think it's our job to prove how smart we've become by pointing out those faults. When we're operating at level 2, we assume that anyone who's not pointing out others' faults is naive or not smart enough to see the faults. And so, we want to educate everybody about everyone else's faults. Many people live their whole lives at that level. But when people operate on level 3, they've wised up a bit more. And of course, on level 3, people see the strengths and weaknesses in the people around them pretty clearly, just as clearly as at level 2. But level 3ers know that usually it's wiser and kinder and more helpful to point out strengths and just let the weaknesses be. Sometimes, when it comes to dealing, with an offense, sometimes it's better for everyone for us and the one who's wronged us to overlook what we can. Now, one of the deep hindrances, to doing that and kind of letting our bitterness go is the conviction that justice should be done, that the fabric of the universe will unravel if people, just can get away with horrible wrongs and deceive everyone. We feel that to let go would be to admit that justice simply won't be done or it can't be done. And so we hold on to our anger and play the story over and over again and the feelings, it shouldn't have happened. It was wrong. How can he be so happy when I'm so miserable? It was wrong. The issue of unforgiveness for many of us is directly related to the fact that we want to retain control. If people get forgiven of the things they've done to us, we wonder if they'll do it again. Or maybe we'll lose the right to manipulate and control them by reminding them that you really did hurt me. You made my life a mess, and so, you need to compensate for the rest of your life, right? Anybody here not know from experience that one of the causes of bitterness is being wronged, seriously wronged by somebody? And you feel not only that it shouldn't have happened, but that you didn't do anything to deserve it, and that the offender, should be held accountable. Well, you know what? You're right. Many times you're right. They shouldn't get off so easy after what they've said or what they've done. And it's the rightness of it. It's being right that just chews away inside and can destroy you. For some of us, this is the core issue of our lives. We're afraid that if we give up our anger and hatred and unforgiveness, we'll stand naked and unprotected before the world that hurt us so cruelly. By forgiving, we think we minimize what was done to us. But see, the forgiveness Paul calls us to extend to those who wrong us is not sanctioning the harm they've done. For instance, forgiveness does not mean that you can't participate in activities that impose consequences on the behavior of the one who has wronged you, especially if that behavior was abusive or criminal. Nor is forgiveness about ignoring harm and acting as if nothing happened. It's the opposite. True forgiveness requires acknowledging the harm and calling it what it is. True forgiveness is not naive, foolish, simplistic, look the other way pretense that all is well and parties should return to relating as they did before the offense. True forgiveness also doesn't mean that you should feel like you need to prove your forgiveness by an interaction with somebody who has wronged you, especially if there's risk that, of further harm. True forgiveness is something we can extend with or without the offender being aware of it. I mean, in some circles, Christians will push the idea that victims of some serious offense should just forgive and forget. Even a crime. Bury the memories. Never mention the past. Or some argue that victims should just hand it over to Jesus and everything will be fine. Well, these, are simplistic approaches to forgiveness at best, but mostly are just cruel. And sometimes re-victimization can occur due to a kind of simplistic rush to forgive, which masks the unwillingness to face the complex layers of damage that can often be done when someone has been hurt or wronged. I mean, sometimes the difficulty we have in reconciling with other people is that we need to see justice prevail. Well, if that's you, listen to what Paul has to say about this in a letter he wrote to the first century church in Rome. Never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. I mean, what does that mean for you? Laying down the burden of anger, laying down the, nursing your hurt and all the feelings around that, laying that down, does that mean there is no wrong against you? Does it mean there is no justice? Does it mean you'll not be vindicated? Does it mean that the person who hurt you will just get away with that? No. It means when you lay down the burden of vengeance, God will pick it up. And this isn't a subtle way of getting revenge. Rather, it's a way of giving vengeance to the one to whom it belongs. It's taking a deep breath, perhaps for the first time in a long time, and feeling like, at last I can get on with my life. You see, when you're wronged and when you were hurt, God never stepped off his throne. He was never unknowing. He was not surprised. I mean, no wrong ever committed against you, not in the darkest hour of any night, was ever missed. God has a record, and he's going to settle up. I mean, that's what Paul is saying here. I mean, think about it like this. It was a Veterans Day not too long ago, and around that time there was a story, maybe you saw it, about 888,246 handmade ceramic poppies that were installed around, I think, the Tower of London. And each poppy represented a British or Commonwealth soldier who died during World War I. And, like millions of people have visited this site. The former head of the British Army said the great thing about this is that people engaged with this, and I think they've taken ownership of it. And the reason why I think they've done so is that specific number of 888,246. It's not a random number. Every poppy represents a life lost and a family shattered. Well, God knows every wrong against you. He has a specific number, and he sees the evil of those wrongs far better than you see it. And he hates the evil of those wrongs 10,000 times more purely and righteously than you hate it, and he claims the right to settle accounts for you. And so the big issue then is, do you believe he will? Do you trust him when the wrong comes and you're really wronged, and the one who offended you is really wrong, and you're right? And your moral indignation rightly cries out, no. Are you willing, rather than let that fester and seethe and chew at your insides, are you willing to believe the promise that God will settle accounts? One of Jesus' closest earthly friends, Peter, writes of Jesus in one of his letters to an early church. He says, when he was reviled, that is Jesus, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. See, part of what Peter is saying there, and part of what Paul was saying to that church in Rome, is we need to leave room in our thinking and in our anger and our reactions when we've been wrong for God's wrath. I mean, what happens when you and I try to take vengeance into our own hands? The correct answer is we always make a mess of things. We're either too strong or too weak, or get the wrong person in the wrong way. I mean, who better than God to bring justice, right? A 1954 Life magazine article titled "Why Johnny Can't Read" argued that Dick and Jane books that most schools depended on were just boring. Maybe some of you guys remember those old Dick and Jane books. I think Spot was also a character in one of those books. Anyway, those books, they had no real story, just illustrations and children and Spot, simple words repeated over and over. And someone needed to break the mold. So a guy named William Spalding was the director of the publisher Houghton Mifflin's education division. He read this Life magazine article and then approached his friend Ted, issuing the challenge, write me a story that first graders can't put down. Well, Spalding's friend, Ted, was a talented artist with a few children's books in publication, but was mostly known for his advertising cartoons he'd done for Ford and NBC and Stanford Oil. Ted claimed, though, that if he could find just 2 words that rhymed, he could write a story that would captivate children. Finally, he found those 2 words that would form the core of his book, Cat and Hat. As you know, for Ted, also known as Dr. Seuss, children's books with wacky illustrations and cool stories became a specialty that revolutionized the way early readers read. Here's what I'm trying to get at. When it comes to vengeance, or when it comes to justice, this is God's specialty. And if you'll leave God plenty of room, plenty of time and space, plenty of methods in which to handle it, and you don't dictate to God how he must act, if you leave God room, he'll certainly handle it. He'll make all wrongs right, so you can be free from the exhausting hamster wheel of vindictive behavior, free to get on, or, to not fixate on your wounds and brokenness, but to get back on track with the life and the relationships that God intends. Thank you for joining us at Tapestry Church this morning. We hope you enjoyed the message. For more information, you may check out our website or Facebook page, and you may see us live weekly at 22 Crady Avenue at 10:30. All are welcome.